The morning mist hugged the banks of the Ominla, curling around the reeds and the low wooden huts of the village as if the river itself were breathing softly over the land. Ebel, 16 and radiant with quiet strength, walked barefoot along the muddy path that led to the water, her calabash balanced carefully on her hip. Her voice, though, was what drew attention. She hummed as she walked, a gentle lilting melody that seemed to make the birds pause mid-flight and the small fish beneath the water's surface twitch as if listening. Even the river, revered and feared by the villagers, seemed to lean closer when she sang, its surface glittering under the sun in waves that mirrored her steps. Children peeked from behind huts, whispering her name with awe, while older villagers shook their heads, muttering that such grace was unnatural for someone so young, someone whose very birth had been marked by tragedy. Her mother had died giving her life, leaving only the lullaby she hummed into Ebel's ears as a baby. That song, they said, had been born from the river's own memory. But where the village saw beauty, Mara, Ebel's stepmother, saw threat. She followed Ebel's progress from the shadows of her hut, hands folded tightly, lips pressed in a thin line. Every note the girl sang seemed to echo the accusation Mara felt pressing against her chest, that Ebel had a power that might overshadow her own, that her stepson, Ebel's father, might be drawn toward this child more than toward her carefully constructed household. Mara had always murmured to neighbors that the girl was cursed, born under a moon that bled red into the sky, and now she watched, calculating as Ebel approached the river. She did not step forward, she only waited, pretending to busy herself with laundry while her eyes never left the girl's slender form. Ebel knelt at the river's edge, dipping her calabash into the water. The river was calm this morning, deceptively so, with only the softest whisper of currents sliding past the banks. She hummed again, this time a tune her mother had taught her, a lullaby meant to soothe both the restless river and the spirits said to haunt it. A sudden ripple disturbed the surface, and a small school of fish leapt, scattering in silver arcs. Ebel laughed softly, her voice carried away by the wind. She did not notice the shadow that lingered behind the twisted mangrove roots, a silent witness to her movements, nor the subtle glint in the eyes of those who wished her harm. By mid-morning, Ebel had disappeared. The villagers noticed her absence when the morning chores had all been done and the calabash remained behind, bobbing gently at the river's mouth. Mothers called for their children, elders shouted for men to search the banks, but no trace was found. Only the faint hum of the wind seemed to answer, carrying a melody almost like Ebel's voice but distorted, sorrowful, and fleeting. Panic began to ripple through the village. Mothers clutched their children, whispering prayers to the river gods. Fathers cursed the river's temperament, wondering if some unseen punishment had claimed the girl. Yet Mara's expression remained unreadable, her lips twitching with a smile that never fully formed. She comforted Ebel's father quickly, almost too quickly, murmuring that the girl had likely wandered off, or that perhaps she had drowned. She was never of this world, she said softly, her eyes never meeting his. The grief of Ebel's father was deep, carved into his every movement. He searched the riverbanks alone at dawn and dusk, calling her name until his voice grew hoarse. The villagers offered condolences, some with sorrow, some with relief that the child would no longer stir unrest or draw attention. Children whispered rumors that they had seen her by the river at night, hair dripping and eyes reflecting the moonlight, but adults dismissed such claims as fanciful imaginations. Yet the river itself was different. Its surface, once lively with reflection and current, seemed quiet, too quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something unseen. That night, when the village lay in the uneasy hush between sleep and moonlight, a voice echoed through the wind, carrying a melody only a mother could recognize. It drifted through open windows, along narrow streets, over the reeds and the huts, soft yet impossibly clear. Villagers awoke, some in terror, some in wonder. They told themselves it was the river playing tricks, the night air carrying sound in strange ways. But those who had known Ebel, the children who played with her, the friends who listened to her songs, swore that it was she. They shivered at the beauty and the sorrow, recognizing the lullaby of her mother entwined in the rhythm of her own voice. Somewhere, beyond the visible banks and beneath the silent currents, Ebel was still there, present in a place that the living could not yet reach. The river, it seemed, was listening, and the world would never be the same again. Night fell over the village like a velvet cloak, and the Ominla mirrored the moon with a silver sheen so perfect it seemed unreal. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and flowering reeds, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called, its cry sharp against the stillness. Mama Oru, the village priestess, moved along the riverbank with her staff tapping the ground, her eyes scanning the water as though it might speak back to her. Her hands, worn and knotted with age, shook slightly, not from weakness but from a sense of urgency that churned in her bones. The river was unsettled. It whispered and licked at the mud, curling around roots and stones as if alive with a restless memory. The child's spirit is not at rest, Mama Oru murmured to the empty air. She had seen the signs before, the shifting tides of the river, the sudden refusal of fish to bite, the way reeds swayed even when the wind was still. Spirits of the drowned, she knew, lingered where betrayal had occurred, and the song of a wronged heart carried farther than the wind could ever reach. Children who dared wander near the water at dusk spoke in hushed tones of a girl standing silently by the riverbank. They described hair dripping with water that glinted like black silk, eyes that caught the moonlight and turned it to glass. Their parents laughed it off as imagination, though none of the adults could deny the chill that ran along their spines when a strange voice carried across the reeds. One evening, Teo, Ebel's closest childhood friend, had lingered longer than usual near the river while tending a small fishing trap. The air hummed softly and then he heard it, the unmistakable, delicate voice of Ebel. It drifted from the current itself, coaxing him forward, whispering as though urging him to listen. His heart thumped and he bent closer to the water, breath held, unable to distinguish between wind, water, or spirit. The voice pleaded, fragile yet insistent, begging to be heard. Mama Oru called a gathering at dawn. The villagers crowded near the bank, shivering under the thin rays of the rising sun. If justice is not given, she warned, voice cracking like old wood, the river will take its own. Her gaze swept the crowd, landing on Mara with eyes sharp enough to pierce deception. Rumors that Mara had wished Ebel gone had already begun to ripple through whispers, and the priestess's words fanned them into suspicion. Meanwhile, Teo found himself haunted by the memory of the lullaby he had heard, humming it unconsciously as he walked the mud-laden paths home. At night, the song returned in his dreams, pulling him toward the river with every note. The priestess told the story of Ebel's birth once again, recounting the night the river rose unusually, flooding gently over the lands for a single night. Her mother had died in labor, and the villagers had thought it a sorrowful coincidence, but Mama Oru knew otherwise. The river, she said, had taken notice, marking Ebel with a gift that could soothe or summon wrath. The child was intertwined with water, and no betrayal could break the bond without consequences. Teo listened with rapt attention, feeling the weight of the river's promise in his chest. He began to follow small clues from that day, the sudden disappearance, the calabash and whispered remarks by neighbors. Suspicion coiled around him like smoke. He realized he must question Mara, whose demeanor remained composed but whose eyes flickered too quickly at unexpected movements. One humid afternoon, Teo's search led him to the interior of Mara's hut, when the woman stepped away to gather firewood. He noticed a small glint beneath her sleeping mat. Kneeling cautiously, he pulled it free, Ebel's necklace, damp and glistening, beads clinging together with the faint smell of river water. His stomach clenched. The realization was sharp, almost suffocating. Mara had lied, and the river had been burdened with more than grief, it had been given injustice. That night, Teo returned to the riverbank alone. The wind carried the girl's melody again, soft, pleading, impossible to ignore. He closed his eyes and whispered back, unsure whether it would reach her, whether she even existed in the form he imagined. The water rippled as if listening, acknowledging, and he felt a strange weight lift from his chest. The river had not forgotten her, and neither would he. By dawn the village felt different. Even those who had scoffed at stories of spirits and river marks noticed it. The subtle way the mist lingered longer, the faint scent of damp hair that reminded them of Ebel, the rhythm of the water that now seemed attuned to more than wind and tide. Mama Oru, though aged and stooped, walked with renewed determination. She whispered to Teo that he must follow the path of the song, listen for the currents, and uncover truths long buried. The river itself seemed to pulse beneath their feet, alive with memory, warning, and possibility. Somewhere beneath the gleaming surface, Ebel waited, not fully gone, not yet returned, but reaching out in the only way she could, through the currents, the whispers, and the song that the river now carried. Beneath the surface of the Ominla, Ebel floated in a world both familiar and alien, a twilight realm where water seemed to hold its own light and shadows, where each ripple whispered secrets of lives long past. She was not dead, though the village believed otherwise. Her body drifted between two worlds, suspended in the memory of the river, caught in currents that carried both solace and sorrow. Time here was different, stretching and folding like the folds of a cloth, but she could feel the weight of betrayal pressing down, a memory she could almost touch. Then the river mother appeared. She was immense and fluid, a being of silver-blue currents, her presence both terrifying and tender. Her eyes were pools of infinite depth, reflecting every wrong the river had witnessed. "You were given to the water not by fate," she said, her voice a chorus of rushing streams, "but by betrayal." The words resonated inside Ebel, and suddenly the memory of that morning came rushing back. Mara's hand shoving her, the whispered curse, the frantic slap of water against her legs. Her mother's lullaby had been stolen, replaced by fear and anger. Ebel's grief coiled like a serpent around her heart, but the river mother's presence gave it form, gave it a purpose. Voices of the drowned, women, children, ancestors, swirled around her, each harmonizing in a melancholy chorus that both comforted and demanded action. They urged her to sing. Not for vengeance, not yet, but to awaken the memory of the river itself, to call the world to witness the injustice that had occurred. Her voice, once a simple song, now carried the weight of ancestry, vibrating through the currents, twisting through the underwater forests, and climbing into the mortal world in faint ripples that tugged at reeds, mud, and memory alike. Above, the village slept, unaware, but the river responded in subtle ways. A sudden overflow in a hidden stream, a strange silence among the fish, reeds bending as if nodding in recognition. Meanwhile, in the mortal world, Mara began to feel the first tremors of fear. Dreams invaded her nights, each morning leaving her bed soaked, the smell of wet hair clinging to the sheets, and her own voice screaming silently in terror. Shadows of movement danced along the walls, echoes of laughter and song that she could not place. She grew restless, pacing her hut, her hands wringing, her mind twisting between rationalizations and the primal terror that some unseen force had awakened. Her husband noticed it first, the way she shivered without cause, the way her eyes darted toward the river as though expecting it to rise against her. Slowly, suspicion began to bloom even in him. Tio, unaware of the full magnitude of what Ebel had become, followed the faint signs she left behind in the mortal world. The shimmer of disturbed water, reeds bent unnaturally, a slight tremor beneath his feet. These breadcrumbs led him closer, pulling him into a quest he did not yet fully understand. He remembered the necklace he had found beneath Mara's mat and the way it had glistened, wet with the memory of the river. His heart pounded as he traced his way back to the riverbank one evening, listening intently. There, floating above the currents like a dream caught between worlds, was her song. He closed his eyes, letting the melody wrap around him. Each note told a story, each breath a plea. The river rippled in response, carrying the sound upstream, across villages and fields, whispering warnings in the language of water. Ebel, in her watery realm, began to explore her own voice, learning its depth and breadth. The river mother guided her gently, showing her how to shape her song to reach the living without harming herself. The notes stretched and expanded, bending around obstacles, curling through reeds and rocks, touching those who would listen with fragments of truth. She remembered her mother's lullabies and intertwined them with her grief, crafting a melody that was neither fully sorrow nor fully hope, but something terrifyingly powerful, a song that demanded to be heard. With each refrain, the river pulsed and moved, and the mortal world began to react. A sudden overflow flooded Mara's doorstep for the first time, creeping along the floorboards, cold and insistent, as if the river were announcing its presence and allegiance. And yet, even as she sang, Ebel felt the pangs of loss, the human connection she would never fully touch again, the embrace of her father, the warmth of her friends. The river mother whispered that this was the nature of her gift, to straddle worlds, to serve justice and memory without ever fully returning to life as it had been. Ebel's song rose, wrapping the river, threading through the village, through reeds, through air and earth alike. Each note reached those attuned to it, like Teo, awakening hope, recognition and fear all at once. The river listened, the ancestors listened, and Ebel, suspended between grief and power, realized that her voice, once a simple gift, had become a force that would bend the river and the world to the truth. The currents whispered back in response, carrying fragments of melody across the banks, reminding the village, whether they knew it or not, that the river had not released her and justice was coming. The days after Ebel's disappearance were unnerving, but the nights were worse. A tension clung to the village like mist rolling off the Ominla, thick and suffocating, stirring unease in every heart. Fish refused the nets of even the most skilled fishermen, twisting and turning as though rejecting capture. Boats capsized with unerring precision near the river's deeper bends, and livestock avoided the banks, noses raised, tails twitching nervously at unseen presences. Even the villagers' youngest children clung to their mothers' skirts, whispering of a girl whose hair glistened with river water and whose song haunted dreams. The elders muttered of curses and spirits, But Mama Oru was clearer than ever. This was no ordinary haunting. Justice had not been served, and the river, alive with memory and anger, was preparing to claim what was owed. Mara's demeanor grew increasingly frayed. She paced her hut with the restless energy of someone who sensed a predator in the air. Every ripple on the water, every whispering wind through the reeds, felt to her like accusation. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that a child had drowned and that superstition had exaggerated her presence. Yet even she could not ignore the river's messages. Water seeped inexplicably through her door in the dead of night, pooling beneath her mats, dampening her bed. Sometimes she would wake to the soft sound of singing, a lullaby only Ebel could have known, echoing around her walls. Fear twisted into anger and anger into paranoia. She accused shadows and neighbors alike, claiming the girl's ghost was tormenting her, while her husband and son began to notice cracks in her composure that were impossible to ignore. Teo, now attuned to the river's signals, discovered a narrow path through the mangroves that led deeper than anyone ventured. Here, hidden from the eyes of ordinary villagers, was the shrine where Ebel had spent long hours singing as a child. Moss-covered clay masks shaped like faces rested on the ground. One in particular drew his attention, a mask molded from river clay, its contours impossibly resembling Ebel herself. The mask seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the water, eyes closed yet alive. Teo crouched beside it, listening, and the river responded. A faint current brushed against his fingers, carrying a fragment of melody so delicate and piercing it nearly brought him to his knees. He understood then that Ebel's song had been more than a gift. It had been a conduit, a bridge between the living and those lost beneath the waves. Word of the river's unrest spread rapidly. The chief demanded immediate action, calling the villagers to offer sacrifices to appease the water spirits. Mama Oru interrupted with a voice that shook the gathering, "You sacrificed your daughter. And she still speaks." Murmurs of unease rippled through the crowd, and the men and women felt their own guilt rise like heat from the river's mud. Teo, standing at the edge of the throng, felt his pulse quicken. He had to act. He had to follow the song to uncover the truth, to give the river what it demanded beyond offerings of goats or grains. The river, after all, did not need livestock. It needed justice, acknowledgement, remembrance. The festival of cleansing was hastily arranged, drums hammered by nervous hands, reeds and mud forming altars to honor the spirits. Villagers gathered, tense and unsure, eyes darting between the ceremonial fire and the water that stretched beyond, dark and silent. Then without warning the river itself shifted. Its color deepened, a violent red spreading across the surface, streaking against the blue like blood carried on waves. The drums faltered, hands frozen in mid-beat, and the villagers gasped in fear and awe. For a single hour, the river remained red, a visible proclamation that the water had absorbed sorrow, rage, and truth. When it returned to its natural color, calm but watchful, the message was clear. It had made its statement and the village had been warned. Amid this chaos, Teo felt a current tug at him, a subtle insistence to follow deeper. He understood that the cleansing was not merely ritual, it was a test, a call to recognize what had been hidden and to act. He traced the sound of Ebel's song, moving through reeds that clawed at his clothes and branches that scratched his arms. Every step brought the faint brush of water against his palms, and with each brush, a note of her melody resonated more clearly in his chest. Somewhere ahead, the river whispered her presence, promising both revelation and reckoning. As night settled over the village once more, Mara's house remained partially flooded, her fears growing tangible in the form of damp floors and dripping ceilings. The river had chosen her doorstep alone. The villagers, unsettled but cautious, watched from their huts, feeling the weight of consequences without fully understanding them. Ebel's song, now a force moving both above and beneath the water, had begun shaping the mortal world, asserting that the river's patience was finite. A storm of truth was gathering, and all who had heard whispers of the girl would soon witness the consequences of silence and betrayal. Ebel's song grew stronger with every passing night, carried on currents that wove through the village, the reeds, and the very earth itself. Beneath the water, she stood in the shimmering half-light of her submerged world, eyes wide with both grief and determination. The river mother hovered nearby, currents twisting around her like living ribbons. "If you cannot return," the spirit murmured, voice echoing like ripples against rocks, "then let your voice reach them." Ebel nodded, understanding the cost immediately. Each visit to the mortal world would strip a memory from her. Moments of laughter, of friendship, of her mother's lullaby, but she did not hesitate. The river had marked her for purpose, and she could no longer remain silent. Her first attempt was delicate. She entered her father's dreams. She appeared as a faint silhouette bathed in moonlight, her voice trembling yet melodic. Her father wept openly, clutching the air where she hovered, overwhelmed by relief, sorrow, and love. Every note she sang stitched into his heart the truth he had ignored too long. His daughter had been taken from him, but she still lived in a form both miraculous and terrifying. Next she sought Mara in dreams. The woman's sleep was restless, punctuated by the sudden shock of cold water that seemed to pour across her chest. Ebel's song wrapped around her mind, haunting her with the melody of innocence corrupted by betrayal. Mara awoke screaming, clutching her ears, blood trickling from tiny cuts that had appeared along her lobes overnight. Her own guilt, once buried under anger and control, now bled into reality. She staggered to the riverbank in a panic, but the water remained placid, refusing to betray Ebel's exact location, as if teasing her with power she could not comprehend. Teo, having listened to villagers' reports of strange happenings, became convinced Ebel was not dead. One evening he addressed a small crowd of youths, recounting how he had heard her voice carrying through the reeds, guiding him to hidden shrines, to masks molded from river clay. His words sparked murmurs of belief and fear. The youth of the village rallied around him, hungry for justice, for clarity, for the girl who refused to vanish. They prepared to follow his lead, sensing that their lives and the river itself were entwined with Ebel's fate. Meanwhile, Mama Oru, aging yet resolute, handed Teo an ancient staff carved with river runes. Its surface glimmered with faint traces of dried water, sacred symbols that could channel the river's messages and protect the bearer from its wrath. She warned him, use it wisely. She speaks through the river, but the river's patience is finite. Teo accepted it with a solemn nod, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He now understood that he was not only seeking a lost girl but also bearing witness to the consequences of betrayal, the potency of truth, and the demands of a spirit-bound river. Mara, sensing the shift in the village and increasingly desperate, sought outside help. A rogue diviner arrived under the cover of night, offering promises to silence the water, to drown the girl's voice before it could strike again. The villagers whispered fears of dark magic, knowing that meddling with the river was an act fraught with danger. The diviner performed a ritual at the river's edge, scattering cursed herbs across the surface. The water hissed and churned unnaturally, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sudden force, unseen hands dragged the diviner beneath the surface. The river calmed as if nothing had happened, leaving only ripples where his body had been, a warning of the consequences of attempting to control what could not be tamed. Teo, standing at the bank, felt the tremor of the river through the staff. Ebel's melody rose faintly above the sound of the night wind, a guiding light through darkness. He realized the stakes had grown beyond anyone's understanding. Mara's guilt, the village's complicity, and the river's memory were converging. Ebel's visits to the dreams of the living were not merely personal. They were a summons, a call for recognition and justice that would ripple through every household, every heart, and eventually, every corner of the river's domain. The villagers began to see signs. Fish leaping in synchronized motion, reeds bending toward the river as if bowing, and a faint shimmer on the water's surface that hinted at something, or someone, watching, waiting. By dawn the village had changed. Fear had been replaced by tension, awe by cautious vigilance. Teo clutched the staff and listened, hearing Ebel's song winding through the reeds and the streets, threading into the hearts of those attuned. Mara, now pale and unsteady, could feel her power slipping, as if the river itself were withdrawing its mercy. And beneath it all, Ebel floated, singing with all the strength of her ancestors, her voice a river within the river, unyielding, unbroken, refusing to be drowned. The stage was set for confrontation, for revelation, for the reckoning that the Ominla had waited centuries to deliver. The village awoke to a tense hush as the chief summoned the people to the riverbank. Word had spread of the river's wrath, of Mara's desperate attempts to silence Ebel, and of the diviner who had vanished beneath the surface. The Ominla gleamed darkly under the morning sun, its waters calm yet imbued with a quiet menace, as if aware that this day would decide the fates of all who lived along its banks. The elders, robed in woven fabrics, stood in solemn judgment, eyes narrowing at Mara, whose composure had frayed into trembling arrogance. She volunteered Teo for the trial, claiming it was the proper test of truth, though her heart burned with a private hope that the river would claim him and rid her of an inconvenient witness. Teo's jaw tightened, the river runes on the staff he carried catching the sun in a faint silver glint, warning him that this trial was not simply ceremonial, it was the river's own judgment. The night before, Ebel entered Teo's dreams. She appeared in moonlight, her hair streaming like ink in water, eyes holding oceans of sorrow and purpose. She taught him a song of protection, a melody interwoven with the river's currents. "Remember each note," she whispered, voice trembling with both power and vulnerability. "This will shield you. Let it guide you, not me." Teo repeated the melody in the dark, feeling it coil around him like a living armor. Each note resonated with the staff he gripped, and the faint glimmering of the runes confirmed that the river recognized both intention and purity. By dawn, Teo felt a mixture of fear and resolve. He knew that entering the river with truth in his heart was the only path to uncovering the betrayal that had haunted the village for so long. The villagers gathered, forming a wide semicircle along the riverbank. Children clutched their mothers, and elders muttered prayers to the river spirits, anxious but curious. Mara stood rigid, fingers entwined tightly as she watched Teo approach the water. The river reflected the sky in fragmented shards of blue and silver, but the surface seemed to ripple unnaturally, as if aware of the truth being tested. Teo stepped forward slowly, staff in hand, and began the protective song. The melody wrapped around him, entwining with the river's own hum, and for a moment, the current surged with gentle insistence, as if recognizing a kindred soul. Villagers gasped, some clutching at each other, sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. As Teo advanced deeper, the current grew stronger, tugging at his legs and arms, testing his resolve. His voice rose, steady now, each note infused with the river's blessing and Ebel's guidance. The water churned around him, yet it parted in subtle eddies, revealing a hidden path beneath the surface. The river itself seemed to bend to the melody, making space where previously there had been only resistance. Teo's eyes caught a shell resting on a submerged stone, glowing faintly with an inner light. Inside, a vision emerged, unfolding like mist. The moment Mara had pushed Ebel, her hand firm, her lips whispering, "Your voice won't ruin my son's inheritance." The scene replayed with brutal clarity, and Teo stumbled back in shock. The villagers watching from the bank gasped as the river's surface rippled, projecting the memory like a living mirror. Mara's hands flew to her face, her composure shattered. The river reacted immediately. Currents swirled violently, lifting waves in a silent display of wrath. Villagers murmured prayers and warnings, some stepping back in fear, others frozen by awe. Teo felt the river's energy pressing against him, yet he did not falter. Each note he sang echoed the truth, cutting through centuries of silence and fear. He realized that this was not merely a test of survival but a conduit for justice. The river demanded recognition of wrongs, acknowledgement of betrayal, and restoration of balance. Every ripple seemed to pulse with memory, every wave a reminder that no deception could withstand its patience indefinitely. Mara fell to her knees at the water's edge, her cries mingling with the roar of the river. She attempted to protest, to claim innocence, but the river would not be fooled. Its current twisted around her feet, wet reeds curling like fingers, and she could feel the truth of her actions pressing against her chest. Teo's song became a bridge between worlds, the melody piercing both the mortal and submerged realms, reaching Ebel who floated just beneath the water. She listened, her form shimmering with anticipation and sorrow, as the river revealed its memory in vivid detail. The vision of her betrayal played out for all to see. Mara's hand, the shove, the whispered malice, the calabash floating abandoned. The truth was undeniable, displayed across the mirrored surface of the Ominla. Then, as if the river itself had decided that the reckoning was complete, a figure rose from its depths. Water cascaded from her hair, droplets sparkling like scattered gems, eyes wide with depth and light, and her voice harmonized with the river in a living song. Ebel had returned. The villagers gasped, some stumbling back, others falling to their knees, unsure whether to worship or fear the girl who had been taken and had returned whole. She stepped onto the riverbank with grace, dripping but radiant, her presence commanding both reverence and awe. The river's current seemed to bow before her, and the staff Teo held glimmered faintly, acknowledging the convergence of human courage, truth, and spiritual power. Mara, now trembling and pale, could only watch as the child she had betrayed stood before her, not as victim but as force, as song, as living testament to justice. The river, patient for centuries, had delivered its judgment through melody, memory, and unyielding truth, and the village would never again forget the girl who refused to be drowned. Ebel stepped fully onto the riverbank, water cascading from her hair in dark, shimmering sheets, her bare feet sinking slightly into the soft mud. The villagers froze, caught between awe and terror. Her eyes reflected the depth of the Ominla itself, dark with mystery and light with revelation, holding storms and calm alike. She did not speak, but her voice carried through the river, through reeds, through hearts, in an unbroken song that seemed to resonate with every life around her. The melody was at once sorrowful and triumphant, weaving through the air and earth, wrapping the village in truth. Mama Oru, aged but unbowed, stepped forward first, kneeling on the damp ground. "The river has returned its daughter," she whispered, her voice thick with reverence and tears. The words echoed like a bell, reaching Mara, who trembled and faltered, the weight of her crimes pressing down like the very waters of the Ominla. Ebel's gaze swept across the gathered villagers. Her presence was not vengeance alone. It was remembrance, it was awakening, it was the reclaiming of stories long silenced. She did not cry out in rage, she simply sang, and her melody caused the river to ripple, rising gently, revealing what had been hidden beneath its surface. Bones of children, women, and ancestors long drowned in silence emerged, pale against the dark water, carried slowly by the currents. Gasps rose from the crowd. The villagers realized the river was more than water. It was memory, history, and justice intertwined. No longer could their negligence or complicity remain unseen. Each person faced the truth of what they had allowed to occur, consciously or through silence. Mara fell to the mud, bound by her own fear, guilt, and the eyes of the village. She could not meet Ebel's gaze, nor could she summon a lie to protect herself. The elders moved swiftly, binding her hands with strips of woven reed, her face a mask of desperation and disbelief. Yet Ebel did not raise her voice in condemnation. Instead she continued to sing. The melody carried the weight of ancestral sorrow, the tenderness of lost childhood, and the fierce clarity of truth. Each note carved channels in the river, directing its waters to reveal hidden injustices, to lay bare what had been submerged by lies. Villagers who had once whispered in secret, shielding one another from accountability, were now confronted by their own silence. Some wept openly, some knelt in shame, and others simply stared, trembling at the power of the girl they had once dismissed. The river's surface shimmered, carrying Ebel's song upstream and downstream, touching every part of the village, every home, every soul that had ignored or participated in injustice. The wind picked up, lifting strands of her hair, rustling leaves, and carrying her melody across the fields. Children paused in their chores, drawn to the riverbank as if compelled by an invisible force. Even the livestock quieted, sensing the shift in energy, the reckoning that had arrived. Teo watched from a safe distance, staff in hand, feeling the hum of the river in his chest, the melody thrumming through his veins. He understood that Ebel's return was not just for her own restoration, but for the village itself, for the river, and for the generations that would follow. Ebel's song began to change, moving beyond lamentation into harmony and clarity. The currents of the river lifted and twisted, carving new channels through the mud and reeds. Paths that had never existed before now glimmered with the promise of change, of rebirth. She walked among the villagers, her presence commanding yet gentle, touching the river's surface with her fingertips, sending ripples of light across the water. Those who had known her as a child recognized her immediately. Those who had doubted her presence before now understood that the girl they had mourned had returned transformed, elevated by the power of memory, truth, and the river itself. Mara was forced to confront not only her own deeds but the collective failure of those who had allowed her malice to go unchecked. The elders debated her fate, but it was Ebel's song that dictated the consequences. She did not curse or threaten. Her melody guided the river to highlight the balance of justice. Mara's punishment became both symbolic and practical. She would be exiled to the far end of the river, where its current never ceased whispering, a reminder of the consequences of betrayal. As the villagers watched, some moved to help repair the damage done to the land, others knelt and prayed, and children ran toward the flowing channels carved anew by the river, laughing and crying at the same time. The river, now renamed in its honor, moved with renewed vigor, carrying Ebel's song along every bank, every village, every home it touched. The melody reminded all who heard it that water bore memory, that silence could not bury injustice, and that those who had been wronged would always find a voice. Villagers began to gather near the banks not in fear, but in reverence, leaving offerings of flowers, grains, and small bowls of water as tribute to the girl who had returned from death to reclaim not just herself, but the history and souls of the river. Ebel finally paused at the water's edge, looking back once toward the village she had saved. Her eyes held depth and clarity, light and shadow, sorrow and resolve. She was no longer just a girl, she was the river incarnate, the voice of those who could not speak, the living reminder that truth flows deeper than deceit. Teo approached cautiously, kneeling, offering the staff she had taught him to wield, a symbol of trust and unity between the living and the river. Ebel accepted it with a nod, her song softening into a lullaby, carrying peace through the currents. The village, now forever changed, understood the magnitude of what had occurred. A child lost to the river had returned, not for vengeance alone, but for remembrance, justice, and the eternal voice of truth. The river, once called Ominla, now flowed with a renewed presence, its currents alive with the memory of what had occurred. The villagers, standing along its banks, whispered among themselves, awe and reverence mixing with lingering fear. Mama Oru stepped forward, her hands lifted to the sky, her voice steady despite her age. "Henceforth this river shall bear the name Omiebel, she who returned," she proclaimed. The words carried across the water, and the river responded with a gentle surge, carrying ripples to every corner of the village. The name was more than a label, it was a declaration that memory and justice had reclaimed the river, that the girl who had been silenced now dictated its song, and that no deceit could again hide beneath its surface. Children repeated the name in hushed tones, their voices weaving through the reeds, echoing the solemnity of the moment. Ebel stood at the water's edge, the sun glinting off her hair, eyes reflecting both river and sky. Villagers expected her to accept the role of river priestess, to remain anchored to this place that had witnessed both her suffering and her return. Yet she shook her head gently, a small, serene smile on her lips. "My voice does not belong to one place," she said softly, though the water carried her words like sacred rain. "It belongs to those who cannot speak, to those drowned in silence, to those whose stories are forgotten." She bent to touch the river lightly, letting her fingers trail through the currents. The water seemed to embrace her hand, sending soft ripples outward, carrying her song upstream and downstream, reaching villages yet untouched, reminding the world that she was no longer confined by land, family, or fear. Teo stepped closer, still holding the carved staff that Mama Oru had entrusted to him. "Where will you go?" he asked, awe and sadness mingling in his voice. Ebel looked at him, her gaze unwavering, as if peering into both the present and the river of futures. "Down the river," she replied, her words carried by a faint hum that merged with the current. "Wherever injustice rises, wherever voices are silenced, I will follow. Wherever the river flows, my song will flow too." She bent to pick up the staff Teo offered, holding it in her hands as if it were a compass, a tool and a promise all at once. The reeds around them quivered as the water responded, bending in quiet applause to her declaration. The villagers watched silently, absorbing the weight of her choice. They understood that Ebel's journey was not a departure from them but a continuation of her purpose, a spreading of her song and memory far beyond their sight. The river's voice had become hers, and hers the world's, carrying warnings, solace, and truth to lands that had yet to hear it. Mothers hugged children close, teaching them the importance of remembering those who could not speak. Fathers bowed their heads in respect, acknowledging the power of justice and the necessity of listening. The village itself felt transformed, its heart now bound to the river's currents, its soul intertwined with Ebel's song. As Ebel stepped onto the water, the surface seemed to lift beneath her feet, carrying her forward as though the river itself had become a living road. Each movement sent gentle waves outward, brushing reeds, banks, and the mud flats, leaving a trail of silver light that glimmered even in shadow. Teo followed on the shore, watching until she became a silhouette against the morning sun, the hum of her song mingling with the rush of water. Behind him, the villagers slowly began to return to their lives, but the lessons of the day lingered in every heart. No child would approach the river without understanding its story. No adult would forget the voice that had risen from its depths. Even Mara, exiled to the far end of the river, could not escape the whispers and melodies that flowed relentlessly. The water carried Ebel's lullaby to her ears, gentle yet persistent, reminding her that the river did not forget, that it never forgave betrayal without reckoning. Night after night, she listened, her solitude punctuated by the weight of her actions, a constant reminder of the power she had sought to evade. Meanwhile, the river's new name, Omiebel, spread beyond the village as travelers and traders passed along the story, the name whispered like a prayer or warning. Far downstream, in villages yet untouched by this history, people paused in their daily routines when a faint melody drifted through the reeds, a lullaby no one had taught them, but one their hearts recognized. Children hummed along, and elders shivered, aware that some force larger than themselves was speaking through the river. Ebel's presence had become both legend and reality, her song a living entity traveling ahead of her physical form, preparing the world to receive justice, remembrance, and the truth. By nightfall, the Omiebel glowed softly under the moonlight, a river alive with memory and purpose. Villagers lit small lanterns and left bowls of water at its edge, paying tribute not just to the girl who had returned, but to the idea that voices silenced by cruelty could always find their way back. Ebel's path down the river would be long, winding through lands unknown, but each ripple she left behind carried a message. Injustice would never be hidden, memory could not be drowned, and the voice of the river belonged to all who had been silenced. Ebel's legend grew with each passing year, whispered along riverbanks and carried downstream by the Omi Ebel. Some said she was no longer human, that she had merged entirely with the river, her voice becoming the current itself, a living testament to memory, justice, and truth. When injustice occurred near any river, her song returned, not in anger but in unwavering clarity, insisting that the world remember. Merchants attempting to dam the waters for profit awoke to flooded homes, their carefully stacked goods soaked and ruined, and all that remained was a wet songbook inscribed with her name. The villagers of Omi Ebel's banks told stories to children of the girl who refused to be drowned, the one whose song could break curses and reveal hidden truths. Mothers hummed her lullaby as they rocked infants to sleep, fathers whispered her melodies to calm anxious hearts, and even the river itself seemed to hum with her presence, carrying her warning into distant lands. Mama Oru, now older and frail, remained a vigilant custodian of Ebel's story. She wrote down the full tale in sacred river ink, careful to hide the manuscript beneath her hut where only those seeking truth could find it. The pages shimmered faintly, catching sunlight as if alive with the river's current, and each word held the weight of memory, ensuring that generations yet unborn would understand that silence had consequences. The priestess would often sit by the water's edge, listening to the faint harmonies of Ebel's voice as it traveled along the currents, a subtle reminder that justice, though patient, never failed to return. Teo, still a young man but now a leader among the village youth, carried the lessons of that fateful year in every decision he made. He had seen the river's power firsthand, had heard the echoes of Ebel's song in dreams and in waking hours, and knew that protecting truth was a lifelong responsibility. He guided the younger generation to honor the river, to speak for the silenced, and to respect the unseen forces that governed life along its banks. Every festival, every offering of water, every whispered retelling of Ebel's return strengthened the village's connection to Omi Ebel and to the girl who had become more than legend. In distant villages, her influence spread in subtle ways. Children woke humming her lullaby, villagers noticed the sudden rise of water after unkind acts, and elders felt the subtle tug of currents that carried warnings or guidance. Travelers recounted stories of a girl walking along rivers, singing songs that could calm tempests or reveal hidden truths. Some doubted, but few could ignore the persistent presence of her melodies, which seemed to resonate in hearts wherever injustice tried to hide. Her song had become a force of nature, intangible yet undeniable, shaping lives and landscapes alike. Even as the years passed, Ebel occasionally visited Teo in dreams, her form fluid and shimmering, her voice carrying gentle reminders. "When I sing again," she whispered, "it will be for the world." Each dream left him both comforted and awed, as if the girl who had once been taken by the river now guided not only him but every heart open to truth. Villagers awoke with fragments of her melodies in their minds, the songs subtly steering choices, prompting courage and fostering honesty in places where deception had once thrived. The river, too, changed with her influence. Its currents became more deliberate, carving gentle channels, carrying fertile silt to fields, and revealing hidden paths that had been lost to neglect or greed. Boats glided smoothly in her waters when intentions were pure, but those who sought to harm or deceive found themselves frustrated by sudden whirlpools, unnavigable bends, or mysteriously shifting sands. Ebel's presence ensured that the river remained not only a source of life but also a guardian of memory, justice, and morality. Legends grew alongside practical lessons. Parents told stories of the drowned girl who had returned, teaching children to respect rivers, to honor ancestors, and to speak out against cruelty. Travelers, hearing of the tale, left offerings at riverbanks far from Omi Ebel, perpetuating a network of awareness that spanned villages, forests, and towns. Each tribute strengthened the connection between the mortal and the spiritual, ensuring that Ebel's influence would endure far beyond her immediate surroundings. Through it all, Ebel remained a subtle, omnipresent force, guiding the rivers of the world through melody and memory. The living and the water became intertwined, their fates inseparable, their stories linked by the enduring truth that no voice silenced unjustly could ever truly disappear. The rivers carried her song, the wind whispered her lullaby, and every current held the potential to awaken those who had forgotten that the world listens always to the voice of the water. Generations later, the Omi Ebel flowed wide and deep, a living testament to the girl who had returned from its depths. The river had changed, shaped not only by time but by the enduring presence of Ebel's song, which traveled through reeds, over rocks, and along the winding banks, touching hearts and shaping lives. Children were no longer allowed near its waters without first learning the story of the girl who refused to be silenced, whose voice had broken curses, revealed betrayal, and reclaimed justice for all those drowned in neglect or cruelty. Parents recited the tale at mealtimes and during evening walks, their voices mingling with the hum of the river, ensuring that no memory was lost, and that no child would approach the water without understanding its power. The annual festivals had become a sacred tradition. Villagers left bowls of water, woven with flowers and grains, at the river's edge, singing the songs of the drowned in unison. The melodies carried through the reeds, spiraling upward into the sky and outward along the currents, a communion with the girl who had once been lost but returned to guide them. Each year, more children remembered Ebel's lullaby naturally, humming it even before learning the words, as if the river itself had chosen them to carry her song forward. Elders smiled knowingly, recognizing the continuity of memory, while parents quietly wept at the realization that justice and remembrance had finally become part of the village's heartbeat. One morning, as the sun painted the sky in streaks of amber and rose, a young girl approached the river with her clay water pot balanced on her head. She hummed a tune that seemed too old, too pure, to have been learned from anyone alive. Her mother noticed and bent down, curiosity and concern in her eyes. "Where did you hear that song?" she asked. The girl shrugged, tilting her head thoughtfully, her small fingers tracing the lip of the pot. "The river sang it to me," she replied simply. The mother's breath caught, the realization settling in that the girl's innocence had been touched by something eternal. Around them, reeds quivered, birds paused mid-flight, and the water's surface shimmered with an almost imperceptible pulse, echoing the memory of a voice that refused to be drowned. The story of Ebel had become inseparable from the river itself. Even those who had never seen her, who had only heard the tale in whispers, felt her presence in the currents, in the wind, in the soft lapping of water against the banks. The Omi Ebel was no longer merely a river, it was a living archive of justice, memory, and song. Merchants navigating its waters felt the subtle resistance when their intentions were selfish, and travelers reported moments of clarity and revelation when crossing its bridges. Ebel's legacy had spread far beyond the original village, touching lives in ways both profound and unassuming, reminding the world that silence could never fully erase truth. Even Mama Oru's writings, now carefully preserved in the hidden alcove beneath her hut, were occasionally found by wandering scholars or young villagers seeking wisdom. The ink shimmered faintly, and the words seemed to carry a quiet hum, as if Ebel's song had been infused into every letter. The tales were not simply stories, they were warnings, lessons, and blessings, ensuring that no generation would forget the girl who had defied death and returned to teach that justice, once awakened, cannot be silenced. And so life continued along the Omi Ebel, intertwined with the currents, the reeds, and the memory of a girl who had once vanished. Children learned to approach water with reverence, to speak truth and recognize injustice, to remember the voices of those who could not speak. Festivals, songs, and offerings became a rhythm of life, a way to honor the past while ensuring the future would remain vigilant. Even distant villages, upon hearing fragments of her lullaby in the wind, paused to acknowledge a power that could not be named, only felt, a gentle insistence that no voice, no story, and no soul could ever be truly lost to silence. The final scene unfolded as the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the flowing waters. The young girl from the morning knelt at the river's edge, her small hands cupping water, singing the lullaby she had heard. The reeds swayed, the river shimmered, and far-off echoes of Ebel's original song seemed to merge with the child's voice, a chorus that carried forward through time. The camera would pan across the river, wide and endless, the water gleaming with reflected light and memory. And in that moment, a narrator's voice, gentle yet haunting, would remind all who listened. They said she died in the river. But the river never forgot. And now it carries her voice, so no one else must drown in silence. The wind carried the final notes, the lullaby echoing across the land, an eternal testament to the girl who refused to vanish, the river that remembered, and the voices that would never be silenced again.